All right, so we've got 100 people in the room. I'm going to get us started so that we have enough time for our first panel. Welcome, bienvenue, Pindigan. My name is Rachel Collishaw, and I'm the president of the Social Studies Educators Network of Canada and of the Ontario History and Social Science Teachers Association. I would like to start by recognizing that we are all connecting today from many, many territories across Turtle Island. I'm so grateful to live here on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin peoples on the shores of the mighty Kichissippi River. I would like to say Pindigan, which is even more than a welcome in the Algonquin Anishinaabe language. It means come on in and all are welcome here. I learned this word because the National Capital Commission worked with the Algonquins of Pickwalknagon to create a park not too far from where I sit called Pindigan Park. It's a beautiful little spot by the river where interpretive elements and artwork introduce visitors to one of the guiding principles of the Anishinaabe people, harmony. Harmony between land, water, air, and people. And this seems a fitting way to start us off, as harmony is achieved not in silence, but in the joining of many voices. As you attend the various sessions today, you will hear many land acknowledgements from many places. There's even a map in the lobby that can help you to find out more about some of those places near and far. I hope you'll be able to hear the harmony of many voices, even if some of us are a little off key sometimes. Harmony is what we're trying to achieve with the Social Studies Educators Network of Canada, or SSENC. If you are here as a member of the Ontario History and Social Science Teachers Association, the Manitoba Social Science Teachers Association, or the Alberta Teachers Association Social Studies Council, you are already a member of SSENC. Our goal is to join together to strengthen our provincial member associations, to create a voice for social studies teachers at the national level, and to connect social studies educators across Canada. I'm so glad that you've chosen to spend time with us today and hopefully tomorrow. And I deeply appreciate the work that goes into leaving your classroom for a day of professional learning. And I sincerely hope that you will walk away with new connections, inspiration, resources, and maybe feel some harmony as you listen to the many voices here and be welcome to bring your own voice to this gathering today. Pindigan. So I would like to hand this over to my colleague in Manitoba, Kevin Lopuck.
Thanks, Rachel, for the beautiful, beautiful words. Very much appreciated. I just wanted to bring some greetings on behalf of the Manitoba Social Studies Teachers Association, Social Science Teachers Association, and you know, today is a big day in Manitoba. We are so lucky to have a union that has helped us preserve a day where all teachers in Manitoba get the chance to have a professional development day of learning. There's over 30 special area groups of educators in the province, and MISTA being one of them. We are very, very fortunate to have that day. And so because of that, I'm really happy to introduce one of the members of our provincial executive, Kerry Enns, to bring greetings from the Manitoba Teachers Society.
Well, good morning. Good morning to MTS members and to all the social science teachers across Canada who are joining the seminar today. I have a lot of reasons for being here. I am a social science teacher, teaching history, global issues, and law. I'm also a member of the Manitoba Teachers Society Provincial Executive, and through my work on the executive, I chair the Professional Development Committee, and I also chair the SAGE Council, the umbrella organization that helps to facilitate all the different special area groups of educators that are offering presentations today. I thank all of the teachers present and the organizations that have made this possible for working towards a very noble goal. And that goal is to educate teachers to ensure that we keep up our professional edge, if you will, and to ensure that what we're offering our students is the very best in education and knowledge about the world, how the world works, and especially how to think about it. That last point, thinking, I think is the key as we move forward. We live in a world where ideas and emotions and feelings are all mixed up together. People make decisions based on brand names, based on which politician they like the best, who looks the best, who sounds the most interesting, rather than looking at the facts. We need to teach our students how to look at facts and how to think about them, and to think about the difference that each different approach, for example, to government will make in society. And you're doing that work and coming together today in order to enhance that work. So thank you for your participation, and on behalf of the Manitoba Teachers Society, I wish you all the best today and for the rest of the teaching year. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Carla Peck, and I am a professor of social studies education in the Department of Elementary Education at the University of Alberta. I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. I just want to do a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. We have two speakers this morning, Dr. Carl James and Dr. Margie Patrick. We are going to ask Dr. James and Dr. Patrick to give their presentations one after the other. And then there will be time for questions following Dr. Patrick's presentation at the final presentation. So what I would ask is if you have questions that come up during both or either presentation, I invite you to use the Q&A to put your questions. And then when it's time for question period, I will take a look at the list of questions that are in the Q&A and also have an opportunity for you to actually ask your questions directly to the presenters. And I just ask that you use the raise hand function to do that. And then we'll make it possible for you to ask your question. So hopefully that's all clear. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests. I am so pleased to be able to do this. These are two people in Canada, two highly regarded researchers whose work I greatly admire. Dr. Carl E. James holds the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, where he is also the Senior Advisor in Equity and Representation in the Office of the Vice President, Equity, People and Culture. His research interests include examination of the schooling and educational experiences, performance, and trajectories of racialized youth. In his work on equity and inclusivity, he explores the ways in which race and its intersection with gender, class, citizenship, and other identity constructs, mediated by accessible and equitable opportunities, account for the lived experiences and attainments of racialized Canadians, particularly Black youth. His recent book is Color Matters: Essays on the Experiences, Education, and Pursuits of Black Youth. Our second presenter is Dr. Margie Patrick, who is a former high school social studies teacher and now an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the King's University in Edmonton, Alberta. Her research focuses on how secondary social studies teachers teach about religion in their classes, whether it be through current events, the curriculum, and/or student questions. Margie is part of the team working at the Center for Civic Religious Literacy, or CCRL, which works with local partners to equip individuals to recognize the contributions of and interact with those who are religious, spiritual, and non-religious. Margie's presentation will focus on the findings of the research that she conducted and that I helped out a little bit with, but she really led it, in several public schools in a large urban setting, and her recent engagement with the draft K-6 curriculum recently released by the Alberta provincial government. So welcome, Dr. James and Dr. Patrick. And Dr. James, I would invite you to begin your presentation. Thank you. Are you able to unmute yourself, Dr. James?
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Are you seeing my screen as well?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks very much for having me. I look forward to the conversation that we'll have. And I'm looking forward to how we will engage some of my questions. I'm really very interested in these questions, and how we all come to these questions is important. So the question I want to grapple with for us now is, as history and social studies educators, what are we telling students about Canada as a diverse society? I'm starting from the point that we are recognizing that we're a diverse society and we are moving towards trying to be equitable with students. And so I always say, what is the knowledges and what the information that we're passing on? And I like the idea of how do we bring students to start thinking of the facts of Canada or what Canada represents. I always think that we need to start off with where we are and the space we occupy and how the space come to being as Canada beyond being called Turtle Island. So I always think it's useful for any history starting studies, social studies, et cetera, should be where we should be the starting point. And as well, it would be good when we do these things that, you know, the idea of residential school and what's going on will not be new and new information for Canadians, but would have been understood because we started with the reality of the colonial history. So I always, I'm informed by this colonial history. And so what you see I will go through is this colonial history that we have come to. I think of how we come to understand it. And if you're thinking of diversity and equity, we need to, and I'm thinking of want to move from our idea of how we construct multiculturalism and the idea that we live harmoniously, just think about how race might be informing the discussion and how we have conceptualized our society. And one of the burning questions for me is always, how do students know about why the population is the way it is? How did it come about, come to being the way it is? Why was it that some people came at one particular time and others came later? So I'm thinking that in social studies or in history, students should be getting a sense of themselves, their location in the society and how that came to be. So I always think then, let's start with the colonial history, and that colonial history was, of course, predicated on the idea of let's keep Canada white. And when we're talking about let's keep Canada white, is the population this is not by accident that the population we have. I always think of about the head tax, the idea when South Asians came and were not able to disembark from the ship in Vancouver Harbor, and we send them back, and how that operated. So why was it then that they were not able to disembark and become part of the Canadian society? And so that for me is a pivotal part of the history that students should know, because it tells us a lot. You know, I always remember, I remember watching a video, a news report when Jagmeet Singh was running for leadership. This is not last election, the election before. And he was in Quebec, and somebody asked him about his presence in Canada, as if not to recall that it's over 100 years ago. We have sick people who have been living here for at least a century now. So these examples and these people are not new to the Canadian society. And how don't we know those things? How is it that we know largely about the Christian religion and all those things, and not some of the other religions that have been here for a long time? So these are missing information in our schooling that we need to pay attention to. So on this slide, as you will notice, we have the South Asian, and we have what's the residential schooling situation. The next, and very, very big, what we tend to always forget is Canada's relationship with slavery. And of course, I always think of how, why, and how people came. You know, so the first, some of the first Africans to have come here came and were enslaved. And this is separate from the US. And, you know, ever so often I always think that we know more about the American slavery, or Canadians or young people tend to know. And we always tend to think of the Underground Railroad, because that's the narrative we tell of our society, the Underground Railroad, when Black people who were escaping slavery and would come to Canada. But we never remember some of those other things that we need to say as well, such as when Black people trying to come to Canada, trying to escape slavery, came from Oklahoma, came to the border of Alberta, and they were not allowed because the federal government said, no, we don't want Black people in Canada. So therefore, these are stories. These are not to say these are bad stories that we should not tell. These are the stories that are significant to how we develop and what we are. And so therefore, I think we need to engage it. And once people know that, then they will have a relationship with that information, and then they will know how to engage that. Yes, the Chinese workers situation. This is another piece of that history where why is it that there were head tax? You know, who were able to come in because they were taxed to come into Canada, and why did we only, and why those? And so what we have here were in those early years, as the historian will tell you, that Chinese men, because they came to work on the railroad, and therefore the expectation that they would return to China after their work here. And then that's also an important narrative for us, because it's also saying who and if these people come, they're going to come here for economic reasons. And immigration has always been an economic endeavor. And so when we look at immigration, for example, we look at the different people who came different times, we're going to always be telling that economic story and economic development of Canada. And that's how students will also come to. And of course, we cannot forget the Indian Act 1876. We should be familiar with it. And one of the questions is, why haven't we gotten rid of it? Why does it still exist? And how is it that it's impacting the lives of Indigenous people and other people related to the society? How is it that Indigenous people put on reserves and therefore maintained and others? And what happened since then? How is the Indian Act, despite our move towards reconciliation, still remain and not grappled with? These are not easy questions to deal with. These are not easy policies to remove, but we have to work with them, and generations learning these things are important in order to move the society from where it is. And I always think one of the things that, that for me is always one of these things I reference is how the Prime Minister at that time, Mackenzie King, his statement in the House in 1947, and where the idea was to keep Canada white. And you know, as he said, there's the general agreement that people of Canada do not wish, as a result of immigration, to alter the population. And remember, when he said the people of Canada, do you think he was thinking of Indigenous people, or was he just thinking of the British and the French, or those people who came from Europe to be in Canada? That's significant. And you will have noticed that I did not present Europeans, but that's also important for us to know. Which European people came when is also significant to that population. You would have noticed that preference were given to the British, and then the French, and then Western Europeans, and then Eastern Europeans, and so Southern Europeans also. All those things have particular implications and have particular timing when they came, all in relation to how we wanted Canada to be populated, the diversity that we wanted and preferred to have as a society. I hope that we can take up some of these questions as we go on. These are some other slides I just wanted to show about how this happened. Another important point for me here is who was able to vote when and why. You know, if voting then is a significant part of how the democracy was established and who would become prime minister, et cetera, you have to, the control of who votes is a very, very important point. So it's we can look at that. Well, the other thing for me is the Japanese and the internment of the Japanese, yet another important story of who were seen as Canadian and whom we might not have trusted to be able to maintain the national integrity of the Canadian society. But not only were Japanese interned, but we know that the Germans were and the Italians were, etc. But even though those ones I named were the internment were lifted earlier than the Japanese, and why would that be the case? And of course, we cannot forget how that famous statement, none is too many, with reference to the Jewish population. Again, that's a part of the story we have to tell, where while they were escaping Europe, Canada did not feel it okay to have Jewish people land in the Canadian society. And the reason for that is, again, they were not seen as the acceptable immigrant to perhaps populate the Canadian society. In 1921, when we look at the population, we know until 1967, it was 1921, 1.3 of the Canadian population were Indigenous, and then Asian, and they were Black. Note the preference at that time were to give preference to British and the French. And all that changed in 1967 when the Immigration Act changed. Then is when racialized people, and if you notice, many of the racialized people, the large majority, was when we removed the requirement that Canada wanted people who are coming from non-white countries, and that were how the 1967 Immigration Act enabled. So what I'm saying then, it has been, Canada has then been premised on an ideology of whiteness, and that whiteness ideology forced us to have the population we have. And what I'm arguing then, we haven't gotten rid of that because that whiteness structure continued to operate and serve us in this way. So I'm arguing that with this knowledge of how whiteness helped create the society we have, and then we're going to unpack that, it will become very useful information and useful for our students. So multiculturalism then, despite its claim to preserve the diversity of Canadians, and therefore everybody will be able to live happily, and the idea that people who have come here will be able to maintain their culture. No, I don't think people, once they go into a new context, can maintain their culture. Culture is going to morph, change, etc., etc. So just as the Canadian culture has to also be seen as how it has come about, having had all that historical reference, all those historical situations that has taken place, that has evolved a Canadian culture as we know it today. Am I out of time, Carla?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. You have a couple more minutes.
Oh, okay, good. So one of the things I wanted to also throw in is the whole idea of equity and equality. We in our society, when we're thinking of the population we want to think that, and if we're thinking even of our students, we want to think of ourselves as moving towards a more equitable society. And we're going to treat people and the students and provide an equal information so that students understand their presence in society and their ethnic group. We're going to have to separate equality from equity. In other words, what I'm arguing for equity is the fact we're going to have to treat the information, the students differently. So for example, it might mean doing more work with Indigenous students, with Black students, with racialized students, with South Asian. It might be doing more work there in order to make it equitable, because the information for some is more sparse than for others, and therefore we're going to have to do some making up of that information. Another important thing that when I think about equity is also unpacking the term and how we use it very often, visible minorities. In the Canadian society, we tend to use visible minority to pool all those racialized people or to pool all these people who are not white together. But visible minority is, I think, misses the idea that different people, different racialized people have different relationship with the society. And as such, it doesn't do justice to how we might pay attention to them. So if I'm going to teach history, then I'm not just going to teach history of racialized people. I should name and unpack the situation of Black people or Black students, South Asians, Chinese, South Asians. Or we have to do that if we're going to be equitable and also give the fulsome history of each group. I think I'll leave it there. And the last point I was going to make is, so we cannot move towards just a single story of Canada. We're going to have to also think about how Canada as is made up of a whole lot of different groups and their relationship. But my last question is, in our schools and classrooms, what education are we providing our students, all students, that tells of the cultural, economic, political, and social development of Canada's nation, and the role or presence of their respective ethnic group in that development? I want us to ponder that question as we engage with the fulsome discussion afterwards. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. James, for your very interesting presentation. I'm sure there will be lots of questions during the question period. There have been a couple of questions about video and microphones. In a webinar situation in Zoom, panelists have their mics and videos active, of course, but the attendees of the webinar, your mics and video are automatically disabled until it's time for question period, at which time we'll be able to unmute and you can show your video. So hopefully that addresses that question. Okay, Dr. Margie Patrick, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. And it is a pleasure being here and also to share this session with Dr. James, whose work I have read and from which my own work has really greatly benefited. So thank you. So my question right up front is going to be, does diversity require new definitions of and conversations about religion? It's a big question, and I'm going to plow through a lot of information. And I'm going to cover 2 points. I'm basically going to really briefly go over some representations of religion. How does it get talked about? Religious illiteracy, and then apply some of that to the findings of our research. So to begin, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to just look at some of these pictures and what words do they evoke about religion, the meaning of religion, what is it? So I'll give you 10 seconds. So perhaps words like ritual and practice and institution and buildings and group and transmission, all of those perhaps came to mind. And the important point is that all of this is contested, and it very much depends upon which religious tradition you are talking about where you are positioned within a particular religion. But there is a lot of debate about what religion is, and frankly, there is no one definition that can encompass all of the traditions that we talk about when we are talking about religion. The question about what is it something that is irreducible and unique, or is it a social construction? Is it primarily about the institutions, the organized religions, or is it practiced individually? Is it primarily about orthodoxy, about getting the doctrine right, or is it about how we practice religion? So there are lots of questions about this. And again, it is significantly contested. But there are a number of legal scholars, both in Canada and in the United States, who say that there is, though, a shared understanding of religion that we do see coming out of decisions from the courts. And this is that religion is mostly a matter of individual choice, that there is personal autonomy. In some other scholars that look at this, they say that courts certainly do privilege beliefs over practice, and that this does fit a particular understanding of religion that fits well more with liberal Protestantism than with certain other types of religion. Those who look at how religion is studied and what is the research going on about religion point out that there are still kind of 4 ways that religion is looked at. So first of all, that it is still embedded within institutions, that it is evaluated and discerned in terms of how similar it is to one of the Abrahamic traditions, so to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That it is singular, that people can hold to a religious tradition one at a time, and that is evaluated based upon beliefs and practices. And what we do see actually is that there is a lot of kind of people are increasingly picking and choosing what they like from various traditions, but there is less an embrace of just one religious tradition. Liberalism has also given us part of how we understand what religion is. So my apologies to those who teach ideologies. This is a really simplified understanding of liberalism, but it has, you know, embedded within it these understandings of the individual, and the individual is really important, choice and autonomy and all the freedoms that come and are promised with liberalism. Liberalism has also given us an understanding of the place and role of religion, going back to John Locke and looking at the conflicts that came out of the Reformation and seeing that those conflicts that come out of religion have disrupted the public sphere. And so what we need to do is put beliefs and religion into private life. And that way we can protect the public life, and the ways that we live together will be far less conflicted. And so to this day, liberalism and certainly liberal democracies would like religion to stay in the private sphere. And it also, there's lots of implications about that, which we can't get into. But the part of that is also then religion becomes much more private and much more individual and personalized. What we are seeing though today is that very kind of strict boundary between the public and the private is becoming increasingly fuzzy and blurry, and there's lots of contestations over that boundary. And we see it on many fronts. These are only just 4. So as evangelicals have come in the past number of decades into the political and public sphere, we certainly have Muslims who do not see that same public-private distinction. Indigenous spirituality also don't have that same distinction. And there are lots of spiritualities that, especially those that are around environmentalism, that public-private really tough boundary, it just isn't there. So it raises the question of who gets to redraw those boundaries and where those boundaries are going to be. And so there are a number of scholars, there's a number of people involved in politics and political theorists who are saying that perhaps our definitions of religion, they're Eurocentric, they fit more with liberal Protestantism, but not so much with other ways of of being religious and non-religious. They are modernist and embedded with normative assumptions, and that actually they function as tools of exclusion. Leo Van Aragon has written that when definitions of religion are more subtext than explicit text, they are masked, but they are still incredibly powerful in terms of their effects. And so if we look just at a classroom, they do impact, for example, the relationships that we see between science and religion, the relationship between religious and Canadian values. Are they similar? Are they oppositional? Does one threaten the other? So some of those assumptions that we hold can indeed be informed by our understandings of religion. A second concept is religious illiteracy. This is a picture, it's kind of prompted by some research that Carla, Dr. Carla Peck did over a decade ago that I read about. And that was taking a prompt like this and asking grade 7 students, admittedly in a fairly homogeneous community, but why would students in this picture want an exemption from the no hat policy at school? And the students, many of the students could not make the connection between religious beliefs and what the students were wearing, their turbans. They then took the same prompt over to England, where there are mandatory religious education students, and the grade 7 students there could indeed make the connection. So there are people who are looking at the whole theme of religious illiteracy and saying that we really have lost the ability to talk about religion because we just don't anymore. And so when we do talk about it, we get all these muddled conversations, and they're all very anxious about values, and they get caught up in violence and views about sex, and we just have very knee-jerk reactions because we no longer know very much about religion, and it just becomes reduced to stereotypes and fears and anxieties. So I'm going to skip over that. The only thing to say about that is that the notion of religious illiteracy covers both those who are religious and those who are not, because we do need to educate ourselves about the multiplicity of worldviews that are present in our society and in our classrooms. So what does this have to do with religion and education? So our research went from 2015 to 2018, and we interviewed and observed secondary social studies teachers in public high schools in a large urban area. It was a small research study, but our findings are borne out, at least that's my experience, in subsequent conversations and observations. So when we talked with teachers, there are two ways to talk about religion. One of them is functional. So what does religion do? And most of the teachers talked about religion providing meaning for people, and then substantive, what religion is. And a lot of the teachers talked about religion in terms of what it is. It is about beliefs and institutions, but they also went much broader than that. The teachers were very thoughtful about this. They are social studies teachers. They know the impact and the role of religion in history and on current events. So they went into internal heterogeneity, that no religious tradition is homogeneous within it, that there's lots of diversity within any tradition. They were very well aware of that. They certainly talked about its comprehensive nature, that many religious adherents do see their beliefs and their traditions and their practices as being informative of the way that they live their life in both public and private spheres, the capacity to shape worldviews. There were two teachers that insisted that there is no public role for religion. This is in Alberta, where the grade 8 curriculum is indeed, it is the only curriculum that very explicitly includes religion, but the teachers did say beyond that, there are all kinds of topics that have religion embedded within them, that religion is definitely embedded in that central social studies theme of identity, and definitely in historical and current events. As one teacher so wonderfully stated, religion is part of and contributes to the complexity of the stories that teachers tell. There was basically no teacher that said that they felt comfortable nor that it was appropriate to teach about the beliefs and the practices of religions themselves. They could talk about religion in terms of its role and in current events, but not about the specific beliefs and practices. And their gateway was definitely through current events. We're going to return to that momentarily. And many commented upon its role in conflict. That was pretty well across the board, as one teacher stated, sad to say, but most of the conflicts that we have today, religion forms a part of it. So what is the impact of some of these conversations? One of them is, while there was certainly a willingness to talk about religion, there was fear, and when fear comes up, the kind of the gut response is to return to privatization. So when there is fear that the really religious students, those that are orthodox kind of in their beliefs, that there was a fear of what might other students say that they would find offensive. And then as soon as those fears come in, the instinct is to privatize, to cut down conversations, to limit conversations. And so that immediately then privatizes. For number two there, these were the topics that often came up that teachers said that they did discuss religion in the context of these topics. And absolutely, they have to be discussed. No question about that. But they also are, they form a single story, because in all of these, religion is does not do well in the public sphere. They are negative stories about religion doing well in the public sphere. And there are other stories. So again, not to take away from the fact that we need to teach those stories, but there are also other stories about religious leaders, religious practitioners being peacemakers. And those, of course, don't get covered in the news. This book here, Religion, Women, Religion, and Peace Building, is a fascinating book. So there's more than the single story. And I think that's connected to number 4, that when current events is the gateway to discussing a lot of religion in a classroom, what gets covered in current events? It is the violence that is connected with religion, and it's kind of the extremes, the crazy, the unusual. And so when people are engaged in their community, when they bring about social cohesion, when there's positive contributions, that tends not to get covered. And then for number 3, for every participant, we asked the question, how might education about religion impact the teaching of citizenship and multiculturalism? And that question seemed to catch every teacher off guard. And they made the connection between, well, citizenship, if we're talking about that, we really have to talk about multiculturalism, which means tolerance. And so teaching about religion will increase the tolerance. And my question here is, do we need to have tolerance for religious traditions only because we have already deemed them to be something that that is outside of the norm? And that means that they don't privatize religion, that they see it kind of has a public role, and that's why it needs to be tolerated. So I'm just going to leave that question out there. And just to end with, when Alberta released its draft K-6 curriculum in the end of March, what drew the greatest amount of attention was the social studies curriculum. And it was the inclusion of a lot of very specific detail and beliefs about religion in both grade 2 and grade 6. And it did actually reflect in a lot of ways some of those same definitions and understandings. There was a lot of Christian layering on top of some of these other religious traditions that were happening. And if you look at grade 6, the second understanding here, some of this is being changed on the fly, but originally the understanding is what is in bold. Freedom of religious practices is encouraged, but acceptance can come less easily, in part because newcomers bring new and unfamiliar religious faiths and practices. There was an immediate backlash to that because it seemed to suggest that people who were from non-Christian religions kind of brought discrimination on themselves. So you can see that the government then changed it. I think it was changed within a week to add what was italicized. The other really upsetting part of this is that those who are non-religious do not see themselves in this curriculum. And that has also become a really, really divisive part of this curriculum. And so I think what it all is showing is that, yes, we are a very diverse society, but we still have a lot of work to do about thinking about how we're going to talk about and think about religion in our diverse culture and society. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick. We have, if we could also spotlight Dr. James, perfect. We have one question in the Q&A right now, and I would invite audience members to, if they have other questions that they'd like to put in the Q&A, or perhaps ask live, to use the raise your hand function. And I will do my best to moderate and get as many questions in as possible. If you do ask your question live, I'd ask that you be very succinct and come to the question quickly so that we have time for as many questions as possible. So the first question is from Jen Babcock. She says, this is in the Q&A, Dr. Patrick, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are of smudging in schools and the 7 grandfather sacred teachings in school as culture versus religion. Because it is a worldview, but some Indigenous community members have also told me, Jen, they don't feel either should be taught in schools because it is religion.
Yeah, this is a difficult one. The same one is mindfulness. And a lot of people have said, well, mindfulness is religious because it has Buddhist history. And the smudging, when I've looked it up, I mean, it has actually had some legal rulings on this with smudging. And courts have said that given the calls to action and the TRC, that certainly is an accepted practice to do in schools. I also do think, though, the term was used, culture versus religion, and I don't think that we can do that. There isn't a culture versus religion. There's an iterative relationship between them. Culture impacts religion and religion impacts culture, and there is this go around. And I also think just the last point to that question is, how do we see public schools? Are they secular schools? Are they plural schools? And how do we acknowledge both Canadian history there, but also the plurality of cultures that we have in society? So it's a really complex answer to that, but yeah, it gets at those relationships.
Thanks very much. Okay, a question now for Dr. James. This is from Jen Harris. Do you think it is important that students get a broad understanding of all of the topics that you mentioned during your talk, or that students do a more deeper focus on one of these topics? Jen's school is focused on and organized around problem-based learning, and so is deeper learning focused.
I think it depends on the teacher, it depends on the lesson, it depends on what course that students are taking, it depends on those. So students and teachers might want to go deep in one and not so deep in others, Or, for example, it might be the students of a particular background who want to really go deep into understanding those relationships. And so I think it's useful that all students, and my point to be made is not that because students of a particular background that they should know all about those people. Yes, they should. We are trying to get them understand their location in Canadian society. But I think all students need these information because after all, they're living in the same society and they're all interacting with each other. Also would want to add about religion in one of these things. I like the idea of raising issue of religion, but one of the thinking I've been having that probably Dr. Patrick might want to think of, is there such a thing as being non-religious? And what would that mean? What would that look like? Especially when we think of the complications of people's sense of relationship to many of these things. So, so for example, going deep into religion because people might have a need to understand it fully is one of those things. And, it depends so much on where students are, their capacity and readiness to learn some of these things. Thanks very much.
Thank you so
very
much
much for the question.
Yes, thank you so much for your answer. Dr. Patrick, do you want to briefly speak to Dr. James's questions about what do we mean by non-religious? Does that exist, or how do we think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So religious literacy absolutely does include both the religious and the non-religious, and particularly because in Canada, that is the fastest growing sector. So in Alberta, we can talk about in 2011, that was 31% of the population, and that will only grow when we get the numbers from the latest census. So absolutely, that needs to be included as a worldview, as a system of beliefs, and that we address the stereotypes that exist around what it means to be non-religious, because those exist as well. I have had people email me saying, when people hear that I'm non-religious, they think that I'm XYZ, and that is absolutely not the case. So that also needs to be part of the education system. So we address those stereotypes as well.
Great, thank you very much. Just looking at the list of people who have their hands up, Orisia Petroshin, I hope I've gotten your name right. I see your hand is up. I'm just going to unmute and ask if you wanted to ask a question or perhaps make a comment.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I actually had the same question as previous people had, so you answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. Another question, this one from Tara. Can you suggest some high quality resources for teaching religious literacy in public schools? There's a good opportunity to plug the website, Margie.
Yes, there is a great website. There's two. One is the CCRL, the Center for Civic Religious Literacy. That is one. And the other one is Teaching About Religion. That is a website that came out of the research that Carla and I did, and we collated sites and resources from all kinds of places and put them together.
And perhaps, Margie, would you be able to put those links in the Q&A?
Yes, that's what I was thinking of as well.
Perfect. Yes. So it won't be attached to Tara's question, but I think people will find it if they look in the open question list. Okay, another question. This is from an anonymous attendee. I think the teacher can paint the broad strokes and individual students can insert their own family stories into these bigger narratives. For both Dr. James and Dr. Patrick, how can teachers deal with the pushback from perhaps other teachers or maybe even community members about the religious and or cultural understandings of First Peoples taught in public systems. And then they add, thank you for these important insights. So I don't know who would like to tackle that first.
Okay, the question is about, I think, how can teachers deal with the pushback related to cultural understanding of First Nations, correct?
Yes, the person wrote First Peoples, but I think that's what's understood. Yeah,
Yeah,
Indigenous peoples. Yeah.
Yeah, First people. I always, I see this as a symptom, as an outcome of the education that people might not have had. I also see it as a way in which the narrow narrative that we have presented of our society, of Canada, why these reactions come. So for me, it's getting back to those roots, the getting back to that colonial heritage of Canada that would also address that pushback. So for me, then, teachers, therefore, and all of us, I think, will have to start thinking about what have we missed in the information that we were supposed to have had, or the information that keeps being repeated over and over again that have missed those. So yes, it's some undoing, and those undoing will require the work needed. And teachers are in a very significant position here in order to help people work through these differences. I think here as when we think of our society, then if we talk of the diversity and the talk of the students in our classrooms, therefore it's knowing who the students are, going out there, how we're going to engage students and work with them, and therefore teachers need to learn that. And again, as I always come back to, start thinking of this place called Canada, how did it originate and from whom are we taking it?
Thank you very much.
The pushback is to really push that information.
Thank you. Dr. Patrick, did you want to add another point to that, or?
Just really briefly, because I'm in a teacher education program and I have students sometimes who enter the program with some of these hesitancies, but what I have seen works best, it's a really practical thing, is when we have Indigenous people and elders come in and just speak, and they share their stories and the history. It is a way of making the history very real, and they come out of those sessions kind of with changed views. So it's about making that history real.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question. I think, and Margie's going to be putting the links in momentarily. So question for Dr. James. You referred to how culture changes or morphs once immersed in a new dominant culture. One may infer from this that the original source of the culture stays somewhat stagnant. For example, many Italians in Canada hold to a tradition of large weddings, which was a common practice from the 50s in Italy. However, when Italians returned to Italy, they found that it is not very common. Do you think that dispersed enclaves may at times freeze culture?
That's interesting. I always think, and I always say, when one immigrates from their country of origin, they immigrate with a particular and imagined idea of where the culture is. And they think of that's their reference, constantly their reference. But when they, quote unquote, go back home, quote unquote, they will see a different kind of practices, behavior. And people will see, people at, quote unquote, home will see what they're doing or what they're saying. That's not what we do here anymore. And that's kind of a discombobulation for these people who go back home thinking that home has been maintained as it was. So culture, and again, one of the other things too is because that back home is moving in times, things that new people coming in, new world event, new environmental situation, therefore culture is going to constantly change. So the imagined culture that somebody that Italian might be living with in their head is because they hold on to it because it's a stabilizing for them. And therefore, sometimes going back home jerk them to understand it. So yes, I think culture is never static, never. So is religion, so is religious beliefs, always moving. And interestingly, we might think about, and I like the first part of the question, we might think about that the new information will have us revise what we might have thought about 20 years ago, because things, again, are always changing and we cannot just simply hold things static. After all, we're human beings and we respond to changes that's going on around us.
Thank you very much to our presenters. We are out of time, unfortunately, for the other questions. In fact, I think we're probably over time, which means I didn't do my job as chair as well as I should have. But this was very engaging, and I'm so appreciative of everybody's thoughts and insights and questions.
Thank you so much, Carla, for this amazing for chairing this great panel. And I would encourage everybody to head to the first concurrent session A. And I've seen a number of questions in the chat around how to get there. So you click on the concurrent sessions button that's just above the doors, and workshops and panels. And then you just click on the words for the one that you want to attend, and they'll be in regular Zoom rooms for the concurrent sessions, not this sort of webinar style. So you should be able to see people and chat a little bit more in those smaller sessions. Thank you again, Dr. Peck, Margie, Patrick, and Carl James. This is a thoroughly interesting panel, and thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.